In the World of Warcraft, Frostmourne is a legendary weapon. The Lich King is able to freeze his victims, consume their souls, and turn living beings into the undead. However, all of these abilities are magical and do not exist in reality. If we consider Frostmourne as an ordinary sword without magic, an obvious question arises. Could it actually be used for fencing at all? How heavy would Frostmourne be in the real world? Why is its balance flawed? Which elements of its design serve no practical purpose? These are the questions I will answer in this video. You are watching MiliTime Fiction, and let's begin. First of all, we need to determine which real historical sword Frostmourne resembles. The Lich King's weapon combines characteristic features of several European sword types. In terms of length, Frostmourne corresponds to a bastard sword, also known as a longsword. However, near the guard, the blade features two parrying hooks, a design element typical of the German Zweihänder. There are significant differences between a longsword and a Zweihänder. A longsword, or hand-and-a-half sword, typically weighs no more than 1.5 kilograms and has an overall length of 105 to 130 centimeters. A Zweihänder is much larger. Its average length is about 180 centimeters, with 120 to 150 centimeters taken up by the blade itself. The weight of a Zweihänder usually ranges from 3 to 5 kilograms. Someone who has never held a real forged sword might think that 1.5 or even 5 kilograms is a small weight. In practice, this is not the case. Even a longsword is a heavy piece of metal, especially in real combat. A sword must not only be held, but also used to deliver many fast, powerful, and precise strikes. The effectiveness of these strikes directly affects a warrior's survival. The heavier the weapon, the faster the arm muscles tire, and the quicker combat effectiveness declines. A licensed replica of Frostmourne produced by Blizzard helps us estimate its real-world size and weight. The sword has a total length of 120 centimeters and weighs about 7.5 kilograms. Aside from blade thickness, this replica closely follows the canonical in-game design, so this is roughly how Frostmourne would exist in reality. The problem is that such a sword cannot be used effectively in combat. Even for a well-trained swordsman, a weight of 7.5 kilograms is excessive. An unrealistically large mass is a common issue with many fantasy swords and suits of armor. For this reason, let us set Frostmourne's extreme weight aside. Instead, imagine that it was forged from some unknown advanced material and weighs about 1.5 kilograms, like a normal longsword, while preserving its in-game proportions. What flaws would remain if we judge the weapon purely by its construction, parrying hooks, and counterguard? Let us begin with the blade's unusual anatomy. The first notable feature of Frostmourne is its parrying hooks. As mentioned earlier, in reality, such elements are found only on Zweihänders. Because of their extreme length, Zweihänders had a very large lever arm near the hilt, which made them difficult to control. To address this, historical swordsmiths added a second guard and left the section of blade between the two guards unsharpened. This section is called the ricasso, and it was often wrapped in leather and used as a secondary grip. The ricasso allowed the swordsman to change grip positions. In some combat situations, it was vital to deliver short, fast strikes instead of wide, full-power cuts. Gripping the ricasso shortened the lever and made the sword much easier to control. Now let us return to Frostmourne. Why does it have a second guard? The correct answer is, it does not need one. First, the sword is not long enough to justify such a feature. Second, it lacks a true ricasso. Instead, Frostmourne has a large decorative horn skull in that area. Even if the skull were removed, the blade in this section is heavily thickened and completely unsuitable for a human grip. Moreover, there is too little space between the two guards for a hand to fit comfortably. A clenched fist simply would not fit there. The conclusion is clear. The parrying hooks on Frostmourne serve no functional purpose and exist purely for visual appeal. The overall shape of Frostmourne's blade does not correspond to any real historical sword type. The blade narrows toward the parrying hooks, then widens toward the middle, and finally tapers again toward the tip. The first third of the blade starting from the counterguard is practically useless, and especially the section with the serrations. At first glance, these teeth may resemble a flamberge, but this comparison does not hold up. A flamberge is a type of sword blade with a wavy profile resembling tongues of flame. Many myths surround flamberge blades, claiming that they could cut through armor or split spears in half. In reality, flamberges were rare and expensive because they were extremely difficult to forge and maintain. Sharpening a wavy edge is far more difficult than sharpening a straight one. That said, the wavy blade did have certain advantages. It could not be safely grabbed by a gloved hand, whereas a straight blade sometimes could. While this may sound absurd, grabbing a blade was a real technique in certain fencing situations, since sword edges were not razor sharp. A flamberge, however, could be easily twisted out of a grip, often injuring or severing the opponent's fingers. In addition, wounds caused by flamberge blades were severe and healed poorly. Frostmourne's serrations cannot perform any of these functions. Their placement and small number make them ineffective. As a result, they serve no practical purpose and simply add unnecessary weight to the weapon. On Frostmourne's blade, one can see a faint suggestion of a fuller engraved with runic symbols. In real swords, a fuller increased blade stiffness without sacrificing strength. However, Frostmourne's fuller is so shallow that it would hardly affect the blade's structural properties. Moreover, fullers of this shape did not exist in historical weapons. Interestingly, the licensed replica does not include this fuller at all, likely because it is difficult to manufacture in the form shown in the trailers. The remaining 2/3 of the blade could, in theory, be used for cutting and thrusting attacks. The blade is double-edged, allowing strikes from both sides. Near the tip, approximately 1/7 of the blade is ground at a very acute angle. This indicates effectiveness in thrusting attacks, including against targets protected by mail armor. Considering that the World of Warcraft corresponds to a developed medieval period, the Lich King often fights opponents wearing full-plate armor which cannot be cut through with a sword. The only effective option is a thrust into the gaps between armor plates, and for this purpose, Frostmourne's blade would be suitable. Now let us examine the hilt of the sword. In addition to the decorative steel skulls on the guard and the pommel, which clearly make the weapon heavier and negatively affect its balance, the hilt has several other problematic features. Let us start with the length of the grip. It is designed for a two-handed hold, like that of any hand-and-a-half sword. A warrior could grip such a sword with both hands and deliver especially powerful cutting blows. This grip length is further proof that Frostmourne does not need a ricasso or a second guard. The sword is not long enough to cause serious handling issues even when used with a two-handed grip. The metal rings on the grip and the spikes mounted on them deserve special attention. This is a poor design choice even for a fantasy weapon. First, the spikes would interfere with a secure grip and significantly reduce traction between the hand and the grip. Second, even if the spikes were removed and only the metal rings remained, the problem would persist. The rings have a rectangular cross-section and their sharp edges would dig into the palm. Not as severely as the spikes, but still noticeably. One might assume that these rings are meant to separate hand positions and improve grip control. In practice, however, they do not increase comfort or handling in any way. In real historical weapons, grip traction was improved through ergonomic grip shapes, finger grooves, such as those found on Roman gladius, or by wrapping the grip with textured wire. Nothing resembling Frostmourne's grip exists in real historical swords. The hilt of Frostmourne is also associated with another critical issue: weight distribution. The sword's mass is shifted toward the blade beyond the guard. To a small extent, this is normal, but in Frostmourne's case, the imbalance is extreme. The massive steel skull on the guard, combined with the parrying hooks, heavily outweighs the sword toward the blade. Controlling such a weapon would be extremely difficult. During a cutting strike, inertia would cause the sword to pull itself out of the wielder's hands, severely reducing control. In real swords, this issue is solved by the pommel, often called the apple. It not only secures the entire hilt assembly, but also serves to balance the weapon. Frostmourne's pommel is almost non-existent. It is highly unlikely that this small piece of metal could counterbalance the massive skull on the guard. Theoretically, this could work if the skull were made from an ultralight material and the pommel from an ultra-dense one. However, it is doubtful that the designers considered such engineering nuances when creating Frostmourne's visual design. Conclusion: in real life, an object like Frostmourne would be practically useless. The sheer number of structural flaws makes the sword unsuitable for real combat. The weapon is excessively weighed down by decorative elements, resulting in an unreasonable overall mass. Its balance is heavily shifted toward the blade, causing the sword to pull out of the user's hands during strikes. The grip is uncomfortable and potentially harmful due to the spikes. As for the blade itself, roughly 2/3 of its length can be considered functional. However, given all the other drawbacks, these few advantages would be impossible to realize in practice. I hope you found this format interesting. Share your thoughts in the comments, leave a like, and subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed the video. This was MiliTime Fiction. See you next time.